Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Get in the Mode channel, where we talk about self mastery and innovation. In this episode of Book Talk, we want to kick off a three-part series on Robert Greene's book, Mastery. This book is a must read for anyone interested in self mastery and self innovation. Robert gives practical strategies to help you find your inner genius and pursue mastery over a field that you are uniquely gifted to achieve success. I am joined by my co host on this book talk, Jessica Rink. In part one, Jessica and I talk about discovering your inner calling. One note I want to make: my audio in this podcast has an echo, and I apologize for that. Despite that, I believe you will enjoy it, and I thank you for your patience with it. Hey, Jessica, welcome to the book talk.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much, David, for having me.
So, on this book talk, we're going to talk about Robert Greene's book on mastery. I know it's a thick book. We're going to do it in parts, three parts. So, part one, I think we've kind of selected Discover Your Calling as sort of like the high level theme for the sections that we want to cover from the book. Let's dive into it. Like, I want to ask you, and I've read the book too, so we could make this conversational as much as possible. Um, why should one discover their calling? Let's start there.
Robert Greene is a wealth of information in this book, and I'm pretty sure this book is now my favorite of all time because it deals with the big questions that I think are on a lot of people's minds. This pursuit of one's life calling. It's been glamorized in our culture quite a bit, and I think a lot of our society, pop culture, our books, we're all driving towards that purpose. What's your calling? What's your purpose? What's your calling? And the necessity of discovering one's calling, uh, really great insight by Robert Greene. I appreciated what he said about you used to not be able to discover your life's calling. You used to be restricted to whatever the calling was of your family. So think back in any sort of generation that we've got, where your work was decided for you, largely through societal or familial realms. Um, your calling or being able to discover what was unique for you and what lit you up was reserved to the social elite, and it had a ton of political and social barriers around it. So there really was no freedom to be able to create yourself or to create what you wanted to see out of life. And I'm not sure when that changed. I
Yeah, I
it
mean, I think it's probably the Industrial Revolution kind of brought that
yeah.
about. You're absolutely right about, like, back in the feudalistic, days, right? When the noblemen, or these property owners, and then you had this other class of farmers, and people that are kind of working on the land, so to speak. Generation to generation, that's all you did. That was your calling.
That's
You
it.
just didn't, you couldn't come out and say, hey, I want to be an artist or a musician, like that's, or an entrepreneur or anything like that, right? So, yeah,
Yeah,
I'll let you
lest you get laughed out of the family or laughed out of the tribe for something like that. And I think there's a few prolific artists in the book. Why I love it so much. It deals with so much history, and it takes into account the masters of so many different fields, throughout whatever the last 500 years. I think there's some very ancient stories in there, but to be inspired to express your own uniqueness through your work. And I personally believe that our work is our self-expression. It's how we choose to show up in the world. So we have a freedom to choose who we want to be and how we want to show up. And just as you said, it's a largely new concept out of the last 150 years or so.
Yeah, and I also think I like the fact that he describes each one of us are made of unique set of atoms. Like, even think about the way, the our parents' sperm met with the egg or whatever, and just kind of one in a million chances of that happening. And here we are, you and I, talking on this podcast.
Right.
And it's just kind of like, I think he talks about that in the book too, like how unique we are, each of us are.
Okay.
And it would be a little bit of a shame not to have discovered what is unique about us. And that is also another angle, if anything. And obviously, the third angle is sort of like, I always think about this scene in the movie The Matrix, where Neo discovers who he truly is, so to speak, and then the bullets, he can just kind of pluck them out when the machine shoot the bullets at him. He realizes it's just kind of like the Matrix, and it's not real bullets, so he kind of just picks them out. That scene is like fascinating to me, in terms of like, when you really are truly aligned, you are able to perform with, if you want to say, a god-given talent, or what you were born with, so to speak, to really perform at that a high caliber level, right?
That's exactly right. And the book echoes this throughout. You have a destiny to fulfill. And another quote that I love so much, the book is entirely quotable, but become who you are by discovering who you are or learning who you are.
Nice.
So it's
Yes.
not a given that you automatically just come with this destiny written on your head. It's a
That's
process of
yes.
unfolding it.
That's another point too. Like, I also think, like, I come from, I grew up in India, so some of the cultural, like the Hinduism is a big influence in India. A lot of times Hinduism is fate based, FAT, right? So it's more like you are destined to be repeat this, and sort of like it doesn't offer. I mean, to a certain extent, we are all destined to do something, but at the same time, how great it is to love our destiny, right? That's a phenomenal angle to think about too, I think.
Right over my shoulder. I've got it right there. It's amor fati, to love your fate, to love your destiny, and to learn what that is. But I really appreciate what you're saying in terms of that predetermination of it. Is that really so? I think with this freedom and expansion that we're experiencing as a society and a culture, we get to discover it and then really nurture that. And I think this book serves as such a wonderful primer for a deeply intellectual take on what it means to fulfill and find one's own destiny and unique expression.
That's awesome. So I think, obviously there's more to why you should discover your internal calling. But I think these are some of the highlights I thought as well, what you presented here, and, what we discussed. Let's sort of like dive into what are some strategies, what are some ways one can undertake to discover this calling, right? Let's talk
Mhm.
about that.
So I really appreciate through some brilliant examples, and that's how the book is lined up, is Robert Greene talks about best case examples from some masters' lives. And one example he pulled forward was from Temple Grandin, who, brilliant woman, highly autistic on the spectrum, lots of challenges throughout her life, challenges with learning, challenges with socialization. Obviously, her destiny was not written on her forehead for her. She had to discover it. And quite a grueling effort where people would not have expected much out of somebody with autism, especially so long ago. So the book details that to find your calling, um, to focus on what you're good at, no matter how small it is. And for Temple Grandin, what she was good at was having this bizarrely empathetic connection with cows. And
That story was so odd. Like, I mean, you would not expect
yeah,
that, right? Like, how she gets into the squeeze chute is what he
Yes.
called. Yeah. So
Yeah.
and she kind of felt like comfort, and and she was kind of averse to human touch a little bit. It was kind of like the the being on the spectrum or autism sort of like
Yeah.
was getting in her way, right, of feeling that human touch and hug, or perhaps yeah, I'll let you complete that story, but yeah,
Yeah.
for the benefit of
That's
our
okay. It was
audience.
a brilliant story. She's hanging around a bunch of cow pastures and slaughterhouses and seeing that there was just a lot of unnecessary suffering when it came to processing the cows and pulling them through to the inevitable slaughter end. And she made the process infinitely more humane. But coming out the gate, so to speak, when she was younger, there's no way she could have seen that destiny for herself. It's so random. But by practicing what she was good at and really focusing to a fine point degree on what she was interested in, success built upon success, and it eventually led her to her full expression. And so, in terms of strategies for finding one's calling, it's timeless wisdom. Focus on what interests you and what you're good at, what you could meaningfully dedicate a few hours to every day, what interests you, because it's that unfolds and could create something where you lend yourself to mastery down the line. But again, it's not automatic, and the book has a very realistic and practical approach to you do have to put work in. You do have to become somewhat obsessive
Yep.
about whatever your calling is meant to be.
Yeah, it's sort of like you engage in certain activities. What you're saying is certain activities that give you some sort of a power or a uniqueness or something that you really enjoy. Like, and it's hard to describe. Like, it could be like playing the piano as a child for hours together, and then something about it, right? The perhaps the repetition of it, or perhaps being able to hear something and then just kind of play that on the piano or the guitar or whatever it might be. Or for it could even be, I also think, even writing, or perhaps, like, I mean, even entrepreneurship is, in a way, you have multiple choices at businesses. Like, as an entrepreneur, you're problem solving, but even choosing what problem to solve can be much aligned with your internal calling, is how, like, there's another example. I don't know if you remember this one, called Buckminster Fuller, the guy who is sort of like an inventor as a youngster, and then he kind of gets sucked into his family business, and then he thinks like being financially successful is going to be is that that's what he wants to do, and then he ends up not being so successful, and then he's kind of disappointed with his whole life, like, hey, am I a failure because I'm not financially successful? Then he realizes, wait a minute, I was sort of like an inventor as a child, and he kind of falls back to that, and then he comes back and he does a lot of things with architecture and other things that kind of brings him back to sort of like, may not have given him the same amount of financial success that he wanted, but at the same time gave him fulfillment and actualizing his potential.
That's it. And when we choose what's called a false path, it's generally driven by something like money. It's generally driven like, I need to make a bunch of money because I want to feel secure in this life. And people make that their focus, but they don't discover their life path. They end up choosing what's called a false path. And in that, confidence takes a huge hit, just like in the Buckminster Fuller, which I believe he's the one who contemplated suicide at that point.
That's it. That's exactly right. Because
Yeah.
his, yeah, his financial failures kind of made him go that route, almost,
Right.
do it.
And that's it with so many people where their orientation is only money. And what is that? I think it was a line in Willy Wonka. Don't aim for something as common as money. Aim for something that's truly unique and truly yours to express. Because I don't know, personally, as a coach of business people and entrepreneurs, I see a lot of people that's their only aim. and they get burned out by it and never really step into the fullness that they could express through whatever it is they're meant to deliver.
One thing I also wonder, and this is kind of not in the book, but it makes me think like as a young person, perhaps you could potentially pull it off, like because you have so much energy to like in your late 20s and early 30s perhaps. You get into something that's highly competitive, saturated, perhaps with your sheer force uh, and the energy you have, you're able to pull that off. And at some point, they do burn out too. Like I've seen so many entrepreneurs who realize, like, oh my God, like I've given it all, and now I'm in my 40s, and like I just don't want to do this anymore.
Mhm.
Hopefully, they've had an exit by that point. If not, they're kind of like there's a lot of these legacy folks who really are wanting to give that to somebody else, and then their kids and other generations are not willing to, or not interested in taking up that business, right?
Right. There's such a process of reinvention that comes with a life's calling. I mean, we're not calling it, the calling of your 20s and your 30s and your 40s all
That
segmented.
is right. Yes.
It's the whole thing. And I've seen people in my life, especially where it was every single phase of my life built upon one another. And so now that I get into the stage that I'm in now, where I'm bringing it all in and creating something new based on what was platformed before, I think there's a lot of wisdom in that for all of us, that we could take a look back at what we were interested in as a child, what captured us, and then did it continue or did we veer off that path a little bit?
That is a great point. Like reflection, right? It gives you that opportunity to, like in your 40, maybe you can kind of look back and say, I ran that business. I don't ever want to do that again. Or I actually enjoyed those pieces of that, the business that I ran, and I want to continue to do more of that. Like, you could certainly that point about reflection on your past decade, so to
Big
speak,
time.
right?
And what I love about what happens if you don't choose, or if you're aligned to your false path and you're just getting ground down by the process, he says you will be assailed by a varieties of hidden pain and assailed by pain. And there's so many people in their careers that get to a certain point where they just can't do it this way anymore. And they think there's intrinsically something wrong with them. There's not, obviously from this perspective. It's just they've lost an aspect of their calling or their passion or their purpose that needs to be reinvigorated.
Yeah, it's sort of like you feel that emptiness, so to speak, right? You kind of become like a robot when you're just not in that zone. Another another point he offers is being coming across a master and how that could be inspirational. I forget, I don't know if it's Mozart or somebody else that he mentions in the book, that you meet someone or you encounter somebody doing something really well in an excellent manner, and you discover that to be sort of like your internal calling, right? So again, I forget, but that's another way for you to discover your calling too, like something that you were inspired by as a child, somebody that you saw somewhere, having this absolutely masterful performance or a talk, or whatever it might be, like how they thought.
That's it. Who are some of the masters that you choose to follow?
Oh, a lot of writers. I do like Immanuel Kant, the philosopher of enlightenment. Nietzsche is a great writer. His aphorisms, and it's very pithy. His ideas are like very succinct. So writers, musicians. I kind of like some musicians who push boundaries. Like Dylan is one of them. Just kind of he had a way with words, and he was able to push certain limits on. You pin him down on a as a folk singer, and then he all of a sudden brings out electric, and like people were like, "What the heck is he doing?" So you just like people like that cannot be pinned down to a certain genre. I really like them. Trying to think. As far as innovation goes, I really like uh, the philosophical thought of Elon Musk. How he sort of navigates like, hey, human beings are meant to innovate and produce and not just consume, right? I mean, I like that aspect of Elon Musk a lot. How about you?
I'm inspired by Musk as well. I'm very curious about running six corporations at that level and what that would require of someone. But he seems to do that pretty well. It's pretty great. And then in terms of the masters, especially from this book, I fell in love with Da Vinci, and oh,
Yes.
such good stories in there. And just to your point, breaking the mold, doing your own thing, and also denying conventional approaches,
Yes.
which is what so many of these examples iterated over and over. There was a rebelliousness to them. And so constructive rebellion, I think that rebellion's kind of an interesting aspect to mastery too, because I would imagine, and certainly was in my own life, where I just spent time, decades, just rebelling without a cause
Mm, mm.
and just kind of pissed off about this and or about that and would complain about things. And that's actually something in this book that causes a diversion from one's calling, is shortcuts, complaining, a lack of curiosity, especially for other people, and tremendous suffering and doubts contributing to quitting. And I suffered from every single one of those things. It's just rebel without a cause. But now, as I get into really the golden age of my career and I'm loving it, there's still a fair amount of rebellion, but it's rebellion,
Of
it's a focused
course.
rebellion.
It's interesting. I don't think we should dismiss that rebel without a cause, which I totally relate to that. Like I had like much earlier anger issues, rebellion, and all of that. And it's good to know to channel that in some fashion. I'm not saying it's not a way to like, hey, you channel it in this direction. It's interesting because some circumstances or some uniqueness about us make us rebel, for a reason, and that energy is in us. How there are multiple ways different people use that rebellion. Oftentimes the worst possible way you can use it is become some sort of a victim,
Mhm.
and then like, oh, I'm just going to be this, I'm a rebel, and that's it, like that's the phase that I'm just going to stay in that area, right, zone, right. The other is sort of like uh, bringing down opposing systems, like it's sort of like always not being a victim, but just kind of criticizing and not offering anything, any alternative, right? So it's just kind of constantly criticizing, this happened, that happened, this system is bad, that system is bad.
Right.
That's another type of rebellion. In a way, like I want to bring back like Dylan's thing. Like, I mean, obviously he was affected by what was happening in the civil rights stuff, in that time, right? At that time, like in the 60s, and the racial discrimination, but somehow he was able to channel that into beautiful music and lyrics that everybody was thinking like, wow, this is a profound way to express what you are seeing in this world, so that that you can channel that rebellion into some form of an expression that I think can be uniquely yours.
Absolutely. And perhaps one of the aspects that lends itself to mastery here is being aware of what we complain about or grumble about or want to rebel against. And as you say, channeling that into something productive, because I don't think we want to hear more people complain. I just don't.
There's so many. Oh my God.
But when we cross over that, the complaining or the unrest on that topic is important, but it's got to cross over a precipice and
Agreed.
turn into
Yes.
something useful.
Yeah, I'm not saying, yeah, there was a stage I didn't cross over either. I completely agree. I remained in that sort of like rebellion phase, and I just didn't have the tools. I kind of had to experiment and do multiple things, and I think I would highly encourage anybody who's in that stage to keep experimenting, like doing multiple things, not just remain and question yourself. But yeah, great point on that crossover, which I think should happen. And I think once that happens, the whole, again, that's another calling you've discovered for yourself,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. What do you think about the shortcuts aspect? Have you ever seen anybody try and take a shortcut to their own mastery?
You know, it doesn't last long, I think. Yes, you can do that to some extent, but then there's not depth to what you bring to the table, right? So yeah, I mean, these days we talk about biohacking and all these different things. So it's sort of like there are quick ways one can incorporate that into your life, but at the same time, I think he talks about like 10,000 hours to master, any sort of skill or, gain that experience. I completely agree with that. Like, I think, Robert Greene, even if you think about him, like he talks about his own life. He tried many things. He was a journalist initially because he liked writing. At 8 years old, he discovered he had a way with words. He enjoyed words, so he wanted to be a writer. So he thought, if I become a journalist, they're going to pay me. So he was motivated by financial gain. And then, 6 months later, one of the editors or the producers came and told him, like, you are a bad writer. You literally told him you suck. And then he realized, like, wait a minute, I actually am a good writer, but I'm just in the wrong profession, like as a journalist. I'm not a journalistic writer. So gets into films, writing screenplays and things like that. Till 37 he hasn't written a single book. And then, later on he comes out, meets this publisher. I think I forget his name, but anyway, he's one of the publishers for the 48 Laws of Power, which is where was this big breakthrough, right? Like, came much later, after, like, in his 40s actually. So it's really interesting to me that he kept true to his calling. He never gave up writing. He just experimented as a journalist, screenwriter, doing all these other things. And then there was that breakthrough that happened. So, yeah, I mean, what are your thoughts? Like, I'm curious, like, is there a shortcut? Like, have you seen any shortcuts work in the history?
Uh, Only through apprenticeship. And the book spends a ton of time referencing how important an apprenticeship is because one, it requires a humility. I don't have all the answers. Of course we don't. Our calling and to meant to uncover it is really be with the process, study your trade, be obsessive about it, and the only shortcut that might be presented to you is find somebody who's better at it than you are, who's made all the mistakes that you're about to make, and then helps you not make them. So they could save you 5, 10, 15 years worth of effort if one would just humble themselves enough to say, maybe you know
Yeah.
something I don't.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like, I wonder, like, I'm trying to think of, I've not literally told them that you are my mentor, but now I'm willing to even ask someone, like, hey, can you be my mentor? Whatever I can offer from my standpoint, I'm certainly willing and humble to do that. Like, there's not like a ego or anything like that. Like, what can I learn from this guy or that person? I think that's another. like you bring up an important point about humility, right? How many of us have that to even go talk to someone and say, is there any way you can help me in acquire these areas of expertise, right? Since you kind of have acquired it.
And I can't remember who it was in the story, but there is a time where you're supposed to outgrow your mentor. And it was a scientist. Was it
That's
Faraday?
right. I believe you're right. Yeah, it's been, I don't remember exactly who it
Yeah.
was.
Somebody
Um,
was chosen to be a lab rat and wanted to excel as a premier scientist and was
that's right.
brilliant at it, but his mentor taught him everything that he could. And when it was time for, I'm pretty sure it was Faraday to get his big
Yeah.
break, his
Yeah, I
mentor
think
was
you're
like,
right. Yes,
nope,
no, it's kind
held
of,
him back.
yeah, I'm recollecting it. And it's, yeah, you're right about like, and it's funny, like, I think his mentor wanted to keep him there, like locked in. And he kind of rebelled at that point, like, no, I need to do my own things. And one needs to be cautious of that, right? Like when you seek a mentor, you're just not staying as an apprentice for life, but more learning important skills. And like you said, it's sort of like a shorter way so that you can kind of learn from some of the things that they may have made mistakes and things like that, that you can avoid and prevent happening, from happening in your life.
Absolutely. So in terms of shortcuts, I think that's probably about as close as we get on the mastery level of things.
Completely agree. And I think even for that, he does recommend a certain time frame to remain an apprentice, right? So, and this is sort of like in our modern day, that apprentice word is even like, what? I'm an apprentice? Like, it just sounds like condescending, you know?
We all want to be the star
Yeah,
at some point.
exactly. Another, not in this book, another book that I've been reading is also talking about this. We all want to naturally do something like in our flow state or something like that. And little do we realize, to get to that flow state, there's so much work and expertise and background, foundation that we need to have as a person to really be in that flow state. This mindset, like, and I had the same mindset too, like I'm gonna all of a sudden be in this flow state if only these things happened. It was always external, it was never internal, of creating that foundation,
Yeah, absolutely. And flow state lending itself to an intuitive state of mind too. There's an undercurrent within the entire book
right.
about finding your calling, and that's find your intuition as well. And how does your intuition help create the scenario where you can be very successful in your calling? Well, your intuition would tell you to rebel when it's strategically important for you to do that. Your
Right.
intuition would get you into flow state when it's time to be super obsessive with discovering that next new scientific discovery or new number one hit song or whatever the creation is meant to be.
Yeah.
And then honoring that intuition where it becomes a total trust in oneself and in one's own path, which
Mhm.
is not easy to do because we want to externalize our wisdom. And so creating that careful balance with a mentor of learning and taking in everything that you need to learn, but not too much, because then you don't want to create an imbalance about what you're supposed to create, something new and original. You can't adopt everything that the mentor tells you.
Right.
Your intuition would guide you on how that path is supposed to unfold. To look at all this scientifically and say and methodically and say this is step one and this is step two would be very difficult. And
Yeah,
so it
yeah.
lends itself to intuition must lead the way in this process.
Totally, yeah. And on that mentorship thing, another I remember reading in Robert Greene somewhere, that try to pick someone who you admire, who's still alive, because part of that process is, we we have a sort of like, if you're a high performer, you like to be competitive and you're always envious of somebody's skills and experience and areas of expertise, right? Sometimes we always want to criticize endlessly somebody's achievements. Like, is there anything that we admire? Like, I know, like, Elon Musk gets a lot of criticism, but is there anything in him that is admirable, and has he and is he a net positive to society, right? That's kind of like that, thinking about it that way, you can actually be less envious and sort of like adopt some of those qualities of the person that you admire, I think.
That's great. Well said.
Yeah. Now let's talk about the skills and expertise prior to, let's say, you've kind of realized this is important. Like, what do I do with my skills and everything that I've acquired prior to it? Like, what are your thoughts on how that gets transformed, or how that finds purpose or meaning?
It was really cool that Ben Franklin was highlighted, the polymath, in that he was, uh, from Green's perspective, a total people person. And so how did he take his every skills and experience and his intuition, everything, how did he culminate this and make it very useful, net positive to society? And it said that Ben Franklin was insanely curious about people. He made people feel like $1 million in his presence. He was genuinely interested in what they had to say,
Yeah.
genuinely curious, and that gave him a ton of credibility out the gate. He made everybody else feel important. And so again, we're mapping back to that humility aspect. But in that, we now know that Ben Franklin is this paragon of leadership in our culture
Yes.
and in many cultures, both here and in Europe. So he, post discovery, what a beautiful thing that he's got the capacity to stay curious about people for the rest of his life and become known for that.
Totally right. I mean, your skills never go away. Like, what you acquired, and it can be put to more meaningful pursuits once you realize what your calling is. And Ben Franklin is an absolute great example. Like, it's interesting. Now we're talking about two different people, Da Vinci and Ben Franklin, both have the Renaissance type, right? Like, they so it's like, I wonder, personally, for me, if I were to choose an age that I could have lived, it would be the Renaissance age. but but I think maybe there might be a new sort of like a age that may come, with AI and other things. Like, people really want to get into things that they really love and enjoy doing, like a Renaissance era of some sort, right?
I
Um,
couldn't agree more.
yeah, it's fascinating to see this sort of like a dawn of a new era, in some sense. And I think, being a Renaissance person, sort of like being well-rounded, like how you described Ben Franklin, like all the skills he acquired were used in so many different ways in different decades of his lifetime. Even Da Vinci, being a, you think he's a painter, he's also an innovator, he's also an entrepreneur, he's also studying lots of biology. It's just fascinating, like, to there's so many layers to their personality and how masterful they are at each of these areas and layers.
I think we're completely on the precipice of another enlightenment where, and it's so important that we not limit ourselves to certain segments. And the book cautions about this. Do not limit yourself to such a myopic view that you're only studying one thing.
That's
Study all the things
right.
from your lens that interests you. So for me, mine's intuition. So I'm reading all kinds of different texts to say, well, what would intuition say about that? What would flow state say about that? How would you optimize this, that, and the other? And that's my lens.
Yeah.
But to limit it to such a fine point degree and become a specialist of one thing would really do us a disservice. But in terms of our society too, we're not limited necessarily by the social and political barriers anymore. This is a largely free society to make yourself whatever you want to be.
Yeah.
And it truly is up to the individual to determine what that is. And there's more tools now than ever
Right.
to become that self-sufficient entrepreneurial spirit type of thing. And the book describes that the future belongs to those who learn more skills and combine them in new and creative ways, because we've got tremendous complexities coming down the pike. I mean,
Yeah.
climate, economy, political, whatever. We've got all kinds of problems in every segment of our society. But those who have trained themselves to handle these complexities with grace and a curiosity have a distinct competitive advantage, but than those that are overwhelmed by the complexities.
Absolutely.
So broaden our horizons, become that Renaissance man or Renaissance woman, and find your niche. And
Yeah.
I just think these are the things that we can gain post discovery. It almost makes me wonder if our calling is even that important to decide, or do we just let it happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a intentionality involved to this, to discovering this. Like, there was a time where I just used to think like it'll just come to me, like like I just have to sit under this tree and meditate. And no, nothing wrong with meditation, but I'm just saying, uh, you cannot, like, you have to be intentional and seek it. Like, I really, I completely believe in that. Like, I've found like much fruitful ventures and projects that I've kind of got myself into when I've been more intentional and really discerning, is this true to what I want to do and what my calling is, right? If I just kind of like, I'm just going to try this, and yeah, you can do that, like perhaps like once you, when you're trying to discover your calling, but sort of like once you discover it, like you want to be more aligned. And again, even discovery process has to be intentional, I think.
Absolutely. And to be focused and intent on it. The conditions need to present themselves for that eureka moment to happen.
That's right. Completely agree with that.
Put yourself in the environment, put yourself in the knowledge, stay curious, study all the topics that interest you and that have that magnetic
Yes.
pull. And then a eureka moment can and very likely will happen upon you. And we've seen that across history. It was Einstein's theory of relativity, I think, came to him on a train when he was just chilling out, like on a train.
Yeah.
And then Newton, the apple hits him and he
Yeah.
figures out gravity. And there's just tons and tons and tons of examples of these epiphanatic moments. But to say that epiphany comes without effort,
Yeah, yeah, and
gotta
you
put
also
yourself.
have to be patient too. Like, it's not like, why is the epiphany not coming to me, or why is the breakthrough not happening, right? I mean, as a matter of fact, it's years. Like how Robert Greene says, 10,000 hours of work that you put into something, right? And it's not like it's not like this breakthrough moment, like how we dramatically hear about in all these novels and things like that. But at the same time, it could be very subtle, and you paying attention to that, you realizing like, oh my God, I'm onto something here, is again, that's from I would say intuition, right? Being able to realize that.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm excited for part two. We've got social intelligence as the next section. This has been great. Is there anything that you wanna, last thoughts on part one, on the calling?
I think one last skill that is important to remember, or at least it's presented as a law, the law of creative dynamic. And one of the benefits or attributes of what happens when you envelop yourself in this discovery
Mm.
process, the higher the goal, the more energy you call up from within.
Mm.
So what's that saying? If the goal doesn't scare the crap out of you, it's not big enough.
Yeah, it's kind of like the BHAG, or big, hairy, audacious goal that you need to have, right? Like, if my goal is like, oh, I just want to create something this, like a widget. Like, not saying that it's a bad thing, but at the same time, try to push yourself and challenge yourself is the point, right?
That's it. And
Yeah.
so when we call upon the law of creative dynamic, if that is a law that is universal, that we can call forward as part of our commitment to mastery, then go for it. But the goal has to be pretty large. And
Yes.
there's lots of rewards in this process. I can't speak highly enough about the book, but also about what we're talking, that discovery of self.
Yeah, and I think it's overall leading to a fully actualized, fully fulfilling life that we talk about, right? I mean, it's sort of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like food, clothing, shelter. Yeah, we all need that. And then you kind of go to this community sense of belonging. And then what's sort of like the apex, what's at the apex of that triangle is, self-realization. And if you're a high performer or an executive, like, isn't that the zone that you want to be in? And knowing what your zone of genius or your calling is can get you closer to that, and have you really live that fulfilling life, I think.
That's it. Well said. Thank you.
Yeah. Awesome. I'm looking forward to part two. Thanks, Jessica.
Me too. We'll see you soon.